Imagine a time when the world wasn't completely mapped, when crossing the ocean was the most dangerous thing you could do, and when a bag of pepper was worth a fortune. That's the starting point for the age of exploration. Between the 1400s and 1600s, European powers decided to sail far beyond their shores. This wasn't just a discovery of new lands. It was the start of a massive global exchange that connected continents and created the world we live in today. So, what drove these explorers to risk their lives? Historians often summarize the motives as the three G's: gold, glory, and God. First, they wanted gold, not just the metal, but all forms of wealth, especially the highly profitable spices of Asia. Second, glory was about fierce competition. European monarchs wanted to claim new lands, gain prestige, and become more powerful than their rivals. Finally, God was a major driver. Many explorers felt it was their duty to convert non-Christians and spread their faith across the globe. Before the age of exploration, if you wanted cinnamon or pepper in Europe, it was unbelievably expensive. Why? Because the goods had to travel thousands of miles along the Silk Road, passing through many different hands, each one adding a tax or fee, until they finally reached the ports controlled by wealthy Italian and Muslim merchants. European nations like Portugal and Spain desperately wanted to cut out the middleman and find a direct sea route to Asia, bringing those spice profits straight into their own treasuries. These voyages wouldn't have been possible without some serious technological upgrades. Explorers needed ships that were both fast and reliable. The caravel was a game changer. It had triangular or lateen sails that allowed it to sail into the wind, something older European ships couldn't do. They also relied on ancient tools refined by Arab and Greek scholars, like the compass for direction and the astrolabe to determine their latitude by looking at the stars. These tools made the difference between floating aimlessly and reaching a specific destination. The first nation to really commit to the open seas was Portugal. They had the advantage of a long coastline and an ambitious prince, Henry the Navigator. While Henry didn't actually sail much himself, he financed over 14 voyages down the west coast of Africa and founded a navigation school. Portugal's long-term plan was simple but bold. Find a way around the massive continent of Africa to reach the rich ports of India. It was a slow, difficult process, but they were determined to get there first. It took decades, but the Portuguese goal was finally achieved by Vasco da Gama. In 1497, he led an expedition that successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope, sailed up the east coast of Africa, and crossed the Indian Ocean to land in Calicut, India. This was huge. Da Gama had finally established that all-water route to Asia. Suddenly, spices could be shipped directly to Lisbon, allowing Portugal to challenge the long-standing, wealthy monopolies held by Venice and Alexandria. While Portugal was focused on the east, Spain funded a very different idea proposed by an Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus. Columbus believed the Earth was small enough that he could simply sail west across the Atlantic to hit the East Indies. He was wrong about the size of the Earth, and he completely missed the two massive continents in the way. In 1492, he landed in the Caribbean, believing until his death that he had reached the outskirts of Asia, but instead, he had launched the era of contact between the old and new worlds. As soon as Columbus returned with news of new lands, the kings of Spain and Portugal realized they had a potential problem. They might start fighting over territory. To avoid war, they appealed to the Pope, and in 1494, they signed the Treaty of Tordesillas. This treaty drew an imaginary line of demarcation down the Atlantic Ocean. Spain got to claim all the non-Christian lands to the west of the line, and Portugal got everything to the east. This explains why almost all of South America speaks Spanish, but Brazil, which fell east of the line, speaks Portuguese. The true shape and scale of the globe were finally revealed by the voyage of Ferdinand Magellan. Sailing for Spain, Magellan set out in 1519 to find a western sea route to the Spice Islands. He successfully navigated the treacherous straits at the bottom of South America, which are now named after him. Magellan himself died in the Philippines, but one of his ships eventually completed the voyage in 1522. It was the first time in history that humans had circumnavigated the globe, proving once and for all that the Earth was much larger and that the New World was indeed two separate continents. Once explorers found the Americas, a new group of fortune seekers arrived, the conquistadors. These were Spanish soldiers who came looking for wealth and conquest. The most famous was Hernán Cortés, who, with only a few hundred men, managed to conquer the mighty Aztec Empire in central Mexico. The Aztecs were powerful, but Cortés was incredibly clever at forming alliances with local tribes who hated Aztec rule. Still, the most devastating weapon he carried wasn't a sword or a gun. Down in South America, another conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, was just as ruthless and successful. Pizarro sailed to Peru and encountered the enormous Inca Empire, which stretched along the Andes Mountains. Using a combination of deceit and military force, Pizarro captured the Inca ruler, Atahualpa, and demanded a ransom in gold and silver. Once he got the treasure, he executed the ruler anyway. The conquest of both the Aztec and Inca empires filled Spain's treasury with incredible wealth, making it the most powerful nation in Europe for a time. Why were such powerful empires defeated so easily? There were three main reasons. First, the disease carried by the Europeans, like smallpox, was the biggest killer, wiping out up to 90% of the native population who had no immunity. Second, the technology gap was huge. Steel armor, cannons, muskets, and horses gave the Spanish an overwhelming military advantage. Finally, the Spanish skillfully exploited the political divisions between indigenous groups, turning enemies of the Aztecs and Incas into allies. The true legacy of the Age of Exploration is what historians call the Columbian Exchange. This was the vast two-way transfer of life forms between the Eastern and Western hemispheres, Europe, Africa, and Asia on one side, and the Americas on the other. Everything from plants and animals to people, technology, and diseases crossed the ocean for the first time. This exchange was not equal. It led to both tremendous global growth and enormous suffering. Think about what came from the Americas to the Old World. The most important items were food crops like corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and cocoa. Corn and potatoes were revolutionary. They could grow in poor soil and were incredibly nutritious, leading to massive population booms in Europe, Asia, and Africa. It's hard to imagine Italian food without the tomato or traditional Irish meals without the potato. Yet none of these existed outside the Americas before the 1500s. Conversely, Europe sent a huge variety of things to the Americas. The most transformative animals were the horse, cattle, and pigs. The horse dramatically changed hunting and warfare for some native groups, while cattle and pigs became staples of American farming. Europe also introduced wheat, sugarcane, and coffee to the New World. While beneficial to European settlers, the introduction of sugarcane specifically would fuel a brutal new economic system. The desire to grow profitable cash crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton led to the development of the plantation system in the Americas. These large-scale farms required endless amounts of labor. Initially, Europeans tried to use native peoples, but they kept dying from disease. This massive labor shortage, coupled with the European demand for these luxury goods, led to one of the most tragic consequences of the age of exploration. To solve their labor shortage, Europeans turned to West Africa, establishing the horrific Atlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homes and shipped across the ocean on what was called the Middle Passage, a brutal, deadly voyage. This forced migration not only caused unimaginable human suffering, but also built the wealth of the colonies and the European powers, creating a racialized economic system that would last for centuries. The economic idea that drove this entire period was called mercantilism. It was a belief that there was a limited amount of wealth in the world, so a country had to grab as much of it as possible. The goal was simple: export more than you import to hoard gold and silver. In this system, colonies were essential. They existed only to provide the mother country with cheap raw materials, like lumber or cotton, and then buy the mother country's finished goods. The colonists existed to make the home country rich. The wealth and the sheer volume of global trade sparked a commercial revolution in Europe. New ways of doing business had to be invented to manage the risk and expense of ocean voyages. One major invention was the joint stock company. Think of it as an early version of a corporation. Investors pooled their money to fund risky ventures like sending a ship to India. If the ship sank, no single person lost everything. This rise of shared investment helped shift Europe away from local economies to a truly global money-based commercial system. The age of exploration completely remapped the world, both literally and figuratively. It created the first truly interconnected world, linking all the continents through trade, migration, and culture. It cemented European power as the dominant political and military force for the next few centuries. Crucially, it led to a vast cultural exchange, where languages, religions, and ideas were spread globally. Though it brought immense wealth and knowledge, we must also remember the terrible human cost of this era, especially for the indigenous peoples and the enslaved Africans.